Our host tonight is a veteran journalist who currently hosts the MSNBC news show Jansing and Company, which airs weekdays from 10 to 11 a.m. She has been with MSNBC since 1998, covering major stories such as the deaths of Michael Jackson and John F. Kennedy Jr., the Columbine shootings, the death of Pope John Paul II, and the election of Pope Benedict, as well as the 2000 and 2004 presidential campaign trails. Please welcome Chris Jansing.
It's great to be here. It's great to see so many people here. You see the sunshine, you think no one's going to show up, but it's getting a little cold, and plus we have two great panelists to talk about something that I think really permeates every part of our existence, and certainly for me as a journalist and as I see what's going on, the consequential decisions that are being made all around the world, certainly in the Arab world and of course in Washington, D.C. right now, the concept of good and evil and right and wrong, and really how we approach those questions, whether it's from our secular or our religious perspective. We've got two really terrific panelists here. Just a few housekeeping things I want to get out of the way. We're going to do a little conversation to start out, but you've seen the microphones that are in the middle of both aisles. So after we have the start of the conversation, please make mental notes to yourself if they say things that trigger a question in you, or maybe you brought some already. We'll have an opportunity for you to line up and ask some questions of our panelists as well. But let me tell you a little bit about them for those of you who don't know Michael Dora, who is the executive director here of the New York City branch of the Center for Inquiry. And I have to say, having spoken with him on the phone and then doing my due diligence and reading some of the things that he'd written about online, I expected him to be gray and much older. But that's also spoken as someone who has to wear her reading glasses. So everything's relative in morality and in a vision, I guess. He regularly contributes essays on moral and political philosophy to the blogs Rationally Speaking and Free Thinking. He has a master's degree in political theory from Brooklyn College and a bachelor's in rhetoric and communications from the University at Albany. Father Jonathan Morris is an old friend of mine. We actually met in Rome when he was studying there. He does have a degree in moral theology from Regina Apostolorum Pontifical University in Rome. He is obviously a Catholic priest for the Archdiocese of New York. He is the parochial vicar of the historic Basilica of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, which is here downtown in New York City. He's a contributor and analyst for the Fox News Channel, Fox Business Channel, the Wall Street Journal. His latest book, just out, and I can tell you he sweated blood, sweat, and tears over this book, is God Wants You Happy, From Self-Help to God's Help. So welcome Michael Dora and Father Jonathan Morris, if you will. And they've prepared just some opening statements for us to give you a sense of where they're coming from. And so Michael, if you'll, you want Father Jonathan to start? Father, if you'll come up. Thank you.
The other day I was with a group of people and I told them I was coming to an event, to speak at an event, to be on a panel, dialogue, debate, discussion with the executive director from a group called the Center for Inquiry, and that group was hosting the event, and they knew that I worked for Fox as well as the Catholic Church, and that was going to be moderated by an anchor for MSNBC. And they said, "Are you crazy? Are you crazy?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And then, as Chris was speaking, I thought, my goodness, here I am, just put out a book called God Wants You Happy, and I'm going on a book tour talking to people who don't believe in God, and much of the majority. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here, and it's a pleasure, and I know I'm not crazy being here because I know both Chris and I know Michael. And I trust them as truly open-minded, free thinkers. And I say that with the utmost of respect, Michael and Chris. And I know that Michael is sincere in wanting to find both our areas of common ground as well as our areas of difference. And I think that's a very good thing for society, and it's very good for us individually. I want to get right into some of my own thoughts of why be good. Why Be Good, which was one of the titles of our discussion for today. I think there are 3 reasons for being good. There are probably many more, but 3 that we could say are general categories. The first is because being good will get you something. It's useful, it's pragmatic, utility, self-seeking in a good way as well, self-promoting. That's the first way. The second reason for being good we could call a category of it feels good. It feels good to be good. It feels nice when we're good. Actually, we feel good about it, and that's a good thing. There's a third category, and I want to focus on this. This is my reason for trying to be good. Because it is good to be good. Because it is good to be good. It's just good to be good. And I say this as a Catholic priest. I also say this as a human being who has experienced it, being good and being bad. The church believes, and maybe this is a surprise to some of you, or maybe some of you would disagree with this, that being good and doing good, while useful and sometimes even feeling good, has as its core reason that being good fulfills the deep corners of our human nature and makes a contribution also to the fulfillment of others. Being good fulfills the deep corners of our human being and contributes as well to the fulfillment of other people. The church has always stood up and defended the concept of moral reason, the idea that human reason by itself has the power to reveal that which will genuinely fulfill us. This doesn't mean that every member of the church has done that. There's been plenty. I don't know if you've heard of a pedophilia scandal in the Catholic Church. Or we could go on down the line, but really that's not what this is about. The church argues that the unprejudiced reason of any person, yours or mine, whether religious or secular, can grasp it, and I'm going to give you a few examples, that life is fulfilling, killing is diminishing, that truth is fulfilling, and deception and superstition, on the other hand, are diminishing, the opposite, that health and healing are fulfilling, and sickness and hurting, on the other hand, are diminishing, that peace, justice, family, and other goods as well are fulfilling, and their converse is diminishing. The church has, over the centuries, and not just the Catholic Church, but even in Old Testament times, has defined a little bit more what that means. The 10 Commandments, for example, are not some sort of revelation out of the thin air, but rather a confirmation of what you and I, we believe, can already grasp with what I would consider the God-given gift of reason. And then the Beatitudes, for example, the famous passage in the New Testament, another confirmation and also making specific, a specification. We can get into these things more in a minute. But the church believes, and this is the most important thing, this is what I believe, that unlike Jack Bauer, some of you have seen 24, who has to figure out with his mind that the exact calculation of how am I going to get the most good out of this thing? How am I going to stop this terrorist? Well, maybe the best thing to do is torture the guy. The church doesn't believe that, first of all, we have that, what we would call a godlike capability of figuring out all the different calculations of how much good we can get, but rather that the human reason alone is able to grasp those basic human goods that are fulfilling. And torturing someone, for example, will never, ever fulfill those corners of our being or the genuine fulfillment of others. We can get into it more, but I want to end very quickly with the explanation that I believe that, well, maybe we have some common ground here that we can talk about. There's another element, and that is that as believers in God, we believe that our friendship with God, not God who can command us to do whatever the heck he wants, But friendship with the God of love is a motivation and an addition to our natural reason's ability to say this is good. Okay? We're going to get into this more as well. For example, the whole element of divine justice, that there is divine justice, that we don't have to be the ultimate deciders and the ultimate ones to make justice happen on this earth, but rather that there is something more. And that's why we can say, I'm going to defend these basic human goods no matter what, even though the calculations don't exactly work out. With that, I'd like to turn over to Michael.
Thank you for coming today on this Palm Sunday, I'm well aware. As Chris said in her introductory remarks, I work at the Center for Inquiry. Center for Inquiry is a think tank dedicated to defending science, reason, and secular values. My position at the Center for Inquiry has afforded me a front row seat for the recent culture wars over religion and morality. As many of you know, the so-called new atheists, which kind of started in 2004 as a cultural phenomenon, have really brought debate about religion and morality to the forefront of our consciousness. And so I've had a front row seat for a lot of this. And one thing I've often noticed is the question posed to me and other people like me, secular in nature, how can you be good without God? And in fact, the myth that is the basis for this question, that you need religion to be a decent human being, is so widely believed and harmful that atheists have actually spent entire careers debunking it. Now, this question bothers me mainly because one could just as easily and justifiably ask, how can you be good with God? And that's really, I'm not trying to be polemical or abrasive here. In fact, it's rarely my goal. But the real question before us, and kind of the question before this panel today, is how can you be good, period, with or without God? Now, I think the reason why so many religious believers think that secular people cannot be moral is that they suppose, without God, without a holy book of some sort, there cannot be objective standards for morality. That without God or a holy book, morality is relative, and really anything goes. Now, I believe this is mistaken, and actually I think the only way to construct rational moral standards that can be shared by everyone is through secular reasoning. That is, a focus on the human condition and evidence from the natural world. What I'd like to do very briefly here is sketch what I think is a rational secular moral outlook. And I think in the process you'll see what I actually think it means to be a moral person. Before going any further, though, first I should define some terms. What is morality? I'm going to define it here as a system of beliefs and values relating to the welfare of conscious beings on Earth. I should also state up front where I actually think morality comes from. I think there are three different places where morality comes from. The first is biology, which equips us first with mental hardware, which is essential for us to be moral agents, and also equips us with very basic senses of fairness. The second is culture and upbringing. Depending on what household you're raised in, depending on where in the world you're raised in, you're going to have a different moral outlook. But there's a very important third aspect to this, and that's reason. And Father Jonathan talked about this. Reason, or our ability to question and change what has been given to us by evolution and what has been given to us by culture. Now, that's what morality is, and that's where morality comes from, at least in my opinion. What do I think morality ought to be? What grounds my quest to be a moral agent? Broadly speaking, I think morality should function to increase the well-being and flourishing of both people and societies. There can be tension between those two, but I'm speaking in broad terms here. As such, this is open to some interpretation, so I should probably be specific about a couple moral theories to which I subscribe so you can get a better idea of what I'm thinking. Number one, I adhere to what is often called the harm principle. That is, I try not to cause harm without extraordinarily good reason, and I actively try to reduce the amount of harm that exists in the world. Now, where does this come from? I think this stems from my recognition that other beings have the potential, not just the potential, but also the desire, to be generally happy people free of suffering. And I believe that we should afford these creatures with such capacities and desires a certain level of respect. That is, as Immanuel Kant laid out, we should treat them as ends in themselves, not means to some end. I also adhere to something called rights theory. The idea that there are certain rights inherently worth granting regardless of just about anything, potential consequences, anything like that. Now, many of these rights, to give you an idea of what they are, were spelled out in the founding documents of this country, such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And they've been expanded on since, in, for instance, the UN's 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. To name just a couple of these, they include freedom of belief, speech, and expression, equality before the law, due process, fair trial and treatment, and I was going to add healthcare and education, but I think I'd be opening up a can of worms, and so let's avoid those. Finally, I believe that a large part of fostering this sort of moral framework is to encourage and cultivate virtues and moral character. I believe we should all work towards being prudent, just, wise, honest, compassionate, charitable, and courageous. Now, note that none of what I've just said depends on God or a holy book. Rather, it's taken from a long tradition of moral philosophy that stretches back about 2,500 years to the ancient Greeks. Now, as I've noted already, this is a broad starting point, and before I close and we get to some discussion here, I should note that the fact that this is a broad starting point actually has important implications for our conversation today. Jonathan and I, as he's mentioned, have met before and discussed these things, both on Fox News and over a couple beers. You prefer wine, actually. And Guinness, right? And in doing so, we found several points of agreement. For example, we're both generally concerned with the well-being of people and societies, as I mentioned before. And we both value things like science, reason, and evidence. Now, I don't want to discount these areas of agreement, but in my experience, the deeper that we've dug, the more we found some points of disagreement. For example, we're both concerned with the well-being of people and societies, but disagree about the sort of characteristics that entail quote-unquote well-being. And we both value things like science, reason, and evidence, but we might have different conceptions of the nature of science and what counts as good reason and good evidence. Fortunately, we will have plenty of time to discuss these differences in the next 45 minutes to an hour before we take some questions, and I'm hoping that we can kind of hash out some of these differences and agreements, and I'm hoping that you enjoy and get something out of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Father Jonathan. I just thought it would be instructive to go over sort of where we are as a society, and the Pew Center does a lot of research on religion, and actually their most recent survey of Americans kind of surprised me a little bit. 26%, now these are how people self-identify themselves, so if you have to check off a box, what would you check? 26% consider themselves to be evangelical Protestants, 24% Catholic, mainline Protestants 18%, 12% atheist or agnostic, although under 30 that number jumps to 19%, and other sort of groups that represent less than 5% of the population in every single state in America: Buddhist, Hindu, Jehovah's Witness, Muslim, and Orthodox. And I think we can all agree on the fact that within those basic faith traditions, there is sometimes a wide variance. I think Father would agree that there has been a degree over the last decades of cafeteria Catholicism, as it's called. You sort of pick and choose which parts of sort of the Roman rules that people care to follow. We've seen it within a number of churches, disagreements about social issues, the Episcopal Church, great divisions over homosexuality. But that gives us a rough outline to say that this is a country that believes in God, that considers itself founded in faith. And I think Michael also made a good point that dating back to Greek times and Hippocrates, there was sort of a basic structure of to do good and to do no harm. But the question becomes, what does it mean to do good? And what is good? And Michael, what is your definition of good?
Well, as I laid out in my opening statement, I think to do good, obviously, is to have some impact on other people in society, some positive impact on other people in society, and that does have some vagary to it because everyone defines good in a different way, and so what I spend my life doing, people in your church might think he's actually doing harm to society. That's a
Give
good
us an
possibility.
example if you can think of one.
Give us an example of.
Yeah, of what you think that you do that is good, that you think people in Father Jonathan's parish would not think was good.
I mean, I get people to question things. I mean, that's a lot. I work for an organization called the Center for Inquiry, so it's a place dedicated to getting people to question things. And I'm not saying that the Catholic Church is opposed to those sorts of things, but a large part of what we do is about
I banned my
religion
whole
now.
church from coming here. I told them they were not allowed, lest they change their belief.
Well, I mean, so, and this is, also what I was saying before, though, is that, a large part of the organization was also, say, promoting secular ethics. And so we just had a campaign called the Living Without Religion campaign. And a lot of the response to that from religious people was that certainly atheists and non-theists can be decent human beings, but either God, the reason they can be good is because God implanted them with that capability, or there's a limit to how good they can be because to not be in a relationship with God thwarts the high that you can get to.
Well, that's an important point, I think. Father, I don't think that there's anybody, reasonable people within any church, who would say that someone who is a non-believer can't be a good person.
Certainly.
That's not even a question. But do you think there is a limit to how good they can be without God in their life?
First of all, I would say I think there are people of religious belief who would say if you're not a believer, you're going to hell, and you can't really be good.
But does it matter if you don't
think,
believe in hell? I suppose that's another question.
I really do believe that there are, and in other words, what I'm saying is I don't think all religious belief is equally true. Okay, I think it's an important distinction. I don't believe that. The reason why I'm Catholic is because I believe what the Catholic Church teaches, and it's different actually from what some other churches believe. At the same time, I believe that not only can people without belief in God be good, I believe they can be better than me. And that's because I believe strongly in what I mentioned about the ability of reason to grasp the truth about what is good for human beings. Now, I believe as well that with faith and with belief in God, I have a better chance, actually, at arriving to the fulfillment of who I was created to be as I see it. So I see it as an addition, but I believe, because I've seen it in my own life and in others, that with all of those added things, we can still be pretty bad. And that's the unbelievable gift of free will that all of us have, to make choices whether or not we're going to seek the good in ourselves and others, as both Mike and I defined morality, or not, or just to reject it.
It's an important point because there are many religious people who don't think secular people can be good and that they're lawless people who are going to end up in hell. And so you can quickly think about the implications of that for your interpersonal relations. If you think that this person is just
intrinsically
not grounded,
bad.
Intrinsically bad, not grounded at all in morality. So it's good to hear. I'm glad that there are religious people who grant that secular people can be good as well. I mean, or even better, actually. That was
and
a
I don't
pleasant
know
surprise.
if this is a question that you get. I also did several years ago for MSNBC a series called The Ethical Edge, and where we took sort of everyday events and put them in an ethical context. And often that meant a religious context. But where do you get the set of rules? What I hear from a lot of religious people is that one of the things that they find useful in church is that it gives them sort of a guide. And that guide sometimes can be as straightforward as the Ten Commandments, which is something that Christians believe, but who then sort of makes the rules? When there are differences, who decides? And the question of, are you ultimately always the arbiter of what is good and not good?
To some extent, yes. I mean, you can go look at the Bible and there are some pretty awful things in there. So it's not like everything that was written as God's word is just automatically taken as sort of endless truth. So even Catholics look at the Bible and say, well, this part doesn't sound very good. We should probably scrap that part. But we should keep this part around. So we're all kind of looking at texts and looking at thinkers and looking at ideas and deciding what makes the most sense. That's just kind of natural. But atheists, secularists, people like that don't think that there's kind of one place where you can go to get this sort of thing. That you have to kind of, what I talked about, my ethical system, my moral outlook, is really a combination of a bunch of different ideas or even parts of different ethical theories that. I've looked back to Greek philosophers, I've looked to people who wrote in the 17th century and said, well, that makes a little bit of sense, that makes a little bit of sense. You kind of cobble it together, but I understand that people get both meaning out of going to church as a community and moral guidance from, say, Jonathan giving his homily.
They usually sleep, but...
But I understand that people get guidance from that sort of thing. Of course, I question sometimes whether or not that's good guidance, but it's not as if atheists and secularists don't have that sort of thing. Organizations like the Center for Inquiry host speakers like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and all sorts of wide range of thinkers who engage with these sorts of ideas. And there are senses of community, less so than having a church that you go to every Sunday, but it does exist. So it's not like it's definitely harder to kind of come up with a rational, objective morality, I think, as a person who is not religious, but that doesn't mean that automatically religious morality is better.
Do you think there's a big difference, and I ask this in the context of knowing you've had these conversations both publicly and privately before, that there's a big difference if you had to put a percentage on what questions in the world you find black and white and which are gray? Do you think you have less gray, Father?
I think that Michael and I would agree on probably the Ten Commandments as a fundamental
Maybe.
outline.
Maybe, although the punishment for not following the Ten Commandments seems a little bit harsh.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And
technically,
unless
I'm working
there's
on a Sunday, so I don't know.
Unless there's no God, of
Yeah,
course. But
okay, as a secular document, maybe.
right. I think it's a great point, Chris. To mix it up a little bit, I think where we probably differ in this, and this is where I think it's easier, so to speak, not for anyone in particular, but for a believer in God in general. I know because there's so many different factors of free will. But if I believe that Michael is not only a material, psychological being that can be reduced to, as you mentioned before, education and biology, etc. But if I believe that he has a spiritual soul that is such because he has a spark of divinity, or in other words, made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore has an inherent dignity within himself that is beyond him being just a fun guy or a jerk, but rather no matter who he is, including if he's a terrorist in front of me right now, he is not entirely bad. I think that is a motivation, a very strong motivation for me to be good to him. I think that is something that, in other words, I don't think it can be discounted very easily as a real motivation and as a real invitation to moral behavior.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that, and I think you could probably judge from my opening statement that I agree with you that people do have a certain level of dignity and that we should afford them a certain level of respect for a different reason, obviously, because of their both potential and desire to experience pain and happiness. And my idea that I like to not experience pain, I like happiness, I like to avoid suffering, so I should kind of do that to other people because they have the capacity to do that. And so I do agree that there is a certain dignity that we should afford those people. It just so happens that I suppose we do it not necessarily for completely different reasons.
Right.
Because part of why you do it is the human ability to reason, that we have, this higher
Absolutely.
Cognitive level. But within that there is, and this is a lot of this conversation. What's going to keep coming up is that there is a difference, obviously, between us, and that's something we're not going to hash out, which is the existence of God. Very simply, you believe in God and I don't. And so you can see that coming out.
That's not something other than the gift of reason being what I would say illuminated by faith. In other words, it's not my belief in God is not contrary to reason, but rather it is, as I would explain it, it is reason inspired by a gift from God, in other words, from outside of itself, that's able to grasp the supernatural reality.
All right, there's a lot to chew off there. So that was actually my point, though, which was that I just happen to think that people have the ability to reason and have higher cognitive abilities. Where they got that ability from, whether or not God guided evolution to create that sort of thing is not something, it's certainly not something I believe in or really think about very often, but I do think that reason has the power to grasp claims of the supernatural. I'm a little bit more hesitant to say that science has the capability to do that, but reason generally...
I would agree with you that science cannot grasp the supernatural.
Science can deal with very specific claims. If you tell me the world is 6,000 years old, science can go out and investigate that sort of thing. Now you can of course say, well, God created it to make it look like it's billions of years old, and there's nothing I can scientifically say at that point. But I do think reason has the ability to grasp supernatural claims and come to terms about whether or not they're most likely true or most likely false. It's not a certainty thing. So going back to what your question was does Jonathan have less gray than I do in terms of hair? Certainly. But I don't really know. That's one of the problems I think that I've had with some of the kind of new atheist movement, and generally I'm friendly to those people and those ideas, but that there is a kind of leveling of the landscape, which is just all religious belief is equally untrue and equally ridiculous, and there's no landscape to it. There are no mountains. So
which is pretty ridiculous.
Which of course is a ridiculous claim. Actually, that is something that science can probably study, because empirically that's just not true that all people believe in the same sorts of things equally. So I wouldn't necessarily say that non-religious people are looking at everything in kind of shades of gray, and that religious people look at it in black and white. It's definitely more complicated.
I would say, Chris, that we do, as believers, and certainly in the Catholic Church, have more areas that we say are always and everywhere wrong, and more areas than I think the secular humanist point that would say are always and everywhere good. I would say yes.
Let me give you a couple of real-life examples, one that may seem a little more frivolous and one that may seem a little more intense. And I'm almost more interested in how you come to your answer than what your answer is. And maybe that will give us some idea, because I've had these discussions with people from other faiths, as well as atheists, agnostics, about whether, in essence, the way we arrive at a decision on a difficult issue about what's good or evil, right or wrong, is essentially the same process with the injection of what believers say is faith. I was at a fundraiser just a couple weeks ago, and as cocktail talk often does, it veered into latest celebrity gossip about a marriage that had broken up and another celebrity who was in the middle of this. Someone who was in this conversation said, well, the two people who were married made a vow and they made a commitment. So the only wrong here is the person who we will dub the cheater. The third person, who is a single individual but decided to get involved with a married man, has no moral or ethical obligation because that person didn't make the vow to the spouse. That person met someone who they found attractive, with whom they made a connection. And so if there is wrong here, the wrong is the person who made the vow and who broke it. And then it became more complicated as people added, well, the degree of wrong is premised upon things like, was it a happy marriage? How long had they been married? Were there children involved? How old were the children? Is getting involved, Michael, with a married person in and of itself not good?
So I'm assuming the third party knew the cheating party was married, right?
That's right.
Right. Well, I think that we essentially have an ethical obligation to all human beings. So it's not as if, well, I don't know that person, so I have no ethical obligation to it. And this actually drives a lot of our kind of mistaken moral intuitions that people who are right in front of us are less important than people who are starving in other countries. But I do think, you mentioned the point about degrees, and I do think that the person who was married and had a vow and went out and kind of sought this sort of thing does have more responsibility in the situation. But the third party, knowing that there was a marriage that they would be breaking up, ruining, getting in the middle of, also has some responsibility in the situation as well.
But a lesser responsibility.
Yeah, somewhat lesser responsibility. I'm not going to start using percentages and things like that.
No, but do you
certainly
think
a lesser.
are there degrees in terms of if it was an unhappy marriage or?
No, I don't. I wouldn't say any of that matters. Although I would say, bringing children into the situation does seem to be a kind of an important step towards, because now that has a lot of implications to other people like children. Whereas in the former situation, it's just really one person, which is to say that it's not to say that it's better or to say that it's good. It's just to say that if there were children involved, I would probably say that it's worse.
And you come to this conclusion from the perspective of you don't want to do harm.
Right, and we have ethical obligations to other people to not cause them harm, without, of course, extraordinarily good reason. And I don't see. I'm trying to conjure up extraordinarily good reasons in that case where the third party would want to get involved, and I can't quite think of any. Maybe if the second party was a supermodel of some sort, and it was like the only chance that you would ever get in your life to. No.
Well then.
But let's not go into those hypotheticals.
Yes,
right?
because they so rarely occur.
Yeah, they rarely occur. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and Father, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you're going to say that it's bad, but are there degrees of bad?
Well, there are degrees of bad, but as Michael's answer, I think, indicated, when we human beings, and this is, I think, a very important foundation for our answer, have to recognize that our reason, as wonderful as I described, as Michael described, it's very imperfect, right? We recognize that some people are much smarter than others, right? So we realize if we're going to depend upon our reason to calculate all of the consequences, even the consequence of harm, we're probably going to come up short because we don't have perfect knowledge. We don't have a perfect ability to grasp the truth. And so in this case, you'd say, well, hey, listen, actually, I can tell, because I'm very smart, that this couple who's married now, they're not going to get along in 10 years from now anyway. And I can tell
By the
that
way,
we're
I've
going to
been
have
reading
this...
in the Inquirer that they've been having trouble.
Exactly. So you end up making all sorts of, and you should, if the only thing you have to depend on is your reason, you should make those calculations. And you should try to get every single, and you go crazy. You go absolutely nuts. The fact that we have a reason is not a definitive enough evidence that we are capable on our own of coming up with all the right answers. And I think that's why I would consider the Ten Commandments and the Beatitudes and personal as well experience of God. Okay, personal experience of God. Okay, advice from others who are all helpful ways of discerning a difficult situation. And it goes back to, again, a recognition that that discernment of God's will is not separate from what I talked about before, those basic human goods that help fulfill us as human beings. Another example, I don't know if you want to get into this, Chris, somebody who's dying and is going through tremendous pain. And there's two people dying, going through tremendous pain. One of them decides, I can't handle it anymore. I'm going to take some really powerful medicine and I'm done. I'm getting rid of my life. I would say, because life, for example, is a fundamental good, a constitutive good, life is inviolable. And that's a big help, because sometimes your feelings are really down, and sometimes your reason is really fogged. And what are we going to depend on? And I think that's why we have the gift of reason inspired by faith.
Do you think your conclusion is different than Michael's in this particular case?
Yes.
On what fundamental level?
Well, because I think Michael is depending only on reason. And not reason in the sense that I just talked about, right, of being able to grasp these foundational, but he's making the calculations. And it comes down to, I think, proportionalism. It comes down to calculating all of the differences of what the possible goods and avoiding this harm, but if I get this much good out of it.
I mean, I wasn't necessarily, I'm certainly not someone who adheres to an ethical theory like consequentialism, which is just saying, well, let's just measure what we can kind of guess or reason the consequences are going to be. You could get the sense in my opening statement that I think there are certain virtues and rights and things of that nature that are just inherently important. And so that's why, in that situation, I don't think there are as many variables as a lot of people would discuss. Well, was the marriage bad?
Right.
I think there are less variables, which is not to say that there are no variables in that situation. So I think we probably differ a little bit less than my answer might have led on.
Although I'm guessing, Father, for you there are no variables. It is intrinsically bad.
This specific example?
This specific example.
Right.
Well, and the other example, though, is the other example you brought up, which is end-of-life issues. Well, that's something where I do think there are variables. If someone is told by their doctor that you have basically zero chance of recovering from this, you have 6 months ahead of you of just complete torture and pain, the worst possible suffering you can imagine, that we have responsibility as a community to say that we care about the quality of life that you have just as much as the fact that you have life to begin with. And so, I'm not calling for people to go out to the streets and just say, well, I'm depressed today, I don't want to live anymore. But those variables do matter.
But the very real example of Jack Kevorkian.
Yeah.
Who intervened in cases where he believed, and there was medical evidence, that life of any pleasure without pain was not in the cards.
Right. And well, what I said was that if we have good reason to think, via doctors and medical workers, that someone is in the position where they're not going to recover from what they're in, and that they're just destined for a certain amount of time before they die, a certain amount of time of suffering and pain, that we have a responsibility to them to alleviate that pain that's not going to go away, and if anything, just get worse. Now, of course, there are some people that recover from these sorts of things. It really doesn't happen very often, but this is the decision made by the person who's in the pain, the family of the person who's in the pain, and the doctors who are saying, this is, laying the cards on the table and saying, this is what this person has ahead. This is what you have ahead. You should be able to make the decision now if you want to face this 6 month road. And you might say, well, the person who says, well, I now want to kill myself or put myself to sleep through some sort of drug is selfish because, you know, there are family members who would be coming over the next 6 months to the hospital to be with this person. But that person has every right to make that decision for himself, I think.
Let me ask you another very politically charged question, but I don't want to get into the politics. I really want to stay in this context of how we come to decisions about right and wrong and who we are as moral people. And there's been a lot of discussion about American firepower and American military might in Libya. And I think that generally we know that the United States decided to become involved militarily because they felt there was a humanitarian crisis. President Obama first opposed it along with the Defense Secretary, Secretary of State Clinton, along with our UN ambassador, believed that there was a humanitarian crisis that was going on. And in fact, Muammar Gaddafi said unequivocally, I will go door to door and I will kill the opponents. I will take you out. You brought it up, so it made me think of it. You talked about whether our moral obligation is different for people right in front of us or people elsewhere. But as a matter of moral obligation and a humanitarian decision, how do you make those kinds of decisions? Because those who were for it and against it made arguments about, well, there are many countries in the world where genocide is going on, or where people are dying unfairly, or certainly where we as a country have supported for other purposes despotic regimes. Where does your moral compass lead you? How do you come to a decision on that?
Well, I mean, you could sit around all day and think about the terrible places in the world where there's immense amounts of suffering, and keep pointing at those and say, well, why are you doing this when there's suffering over there? And you know, at some point you just have to say, there's only so much we can do. We can't do everything. I mean, for instance, I'm a vegetarian, and people tell me, well, you still wear the leather shoes sometimes. It's like, well, you know, I've looked into buying vegetarian shoes, actually. They cost about $250. And I don't have the money to do that, actually. So I'm doing the best I can. And I think that's kind of what the situation in Libya was. It was a very, you know, first off, it was a UN decision. So the global community came together and said, we have a moral obligation to go in here and help people who are being threatened, literally, by death in a very immediate situation. So we have to very immediately respond with a short military action to help them and not be massacred, basically. So, you know, and to say that, well, certainly we haven't done this in many situations before when we should have done it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it now just because we've screwed up in the past. But a lot of this comes back to again, you know, we have an ethical obligation, I think, to other human beings who have the capacity to suffer and be happy, and they have certain rights that I think we should afford them. And so we do have an ethical obligation as a global community, and if not as a global community, I mean, if the rest of the globe said, you know, screw these people, good luck to them. You could make the argument that the United States, with the capacity to do the sort of thing that we've been doing in Libya, has the responsibility to go over there and help people who are being literally faced with immediate death.
And the counter-argument, as you well know, Father, is on the simplest level. That money that is being spent in Libya or in Afghanistan or in Iraq or any sort of foreign aid, which the budget that was just passed, foreign aid became an issue. Why don't we have enough money? Why are we cutting education? Why are we cutting healthcare? Why are we cutting programs for people here? So obviously it's a much bigger discussion, but if you can take it at its core and responsibility to others, which is a fundamental tenet of moralism,
Sure.
How do you approach it?
Well, I think the simple answer for me in terms of specifically Libya is that I don't know. I don't know what the best thing to have done was, because life is very complicated and there are lots of areas of gray. And the church reminds us that we're able to, with the gift of God-given reason, as I would call it, we're able to identify basic moral absolutes. And then even more than that, we're able to get what we could call principles, right? Principles of ethical decision-making. But then it gets down into the real nitty-gritty. And the Catholic Church actually has And I would invite people to look at it. It's a fascinating document it's called the Compendium, and it's a relatively new document, the last 7 or 8 years, called the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. And it offers, based on human reason, not faith, principles, for example, of, and there's always balancing principles. One is, it's called subsidiarity, and that is that no higher level of government or society should do what a lower level of government and society can do for itself. Okay, a fascinating, I love the principle, subsidiarity. In other words, if, in the case of Libya, if they can defend themselves, right? It's not a perfect example, but the global community shouldn't be going in there and doing it for them, right? But then there's this other principle that's called solidarity. So subsidiarity, no higher level of government society should do what a lower level of government society, and that works, that's brings us into healthcare and all that, Michael. But then there's a principle of solidarity. And solidarity is that we have a responsibility not only for ourselves and for those who are around us, but we have responsibility for the broader human family. And so you have to make those decisions. And quite honestly, I don't have all the answers, and the Catholic Church doesn't have all the answers. And that's why the Catholic Church will never tell you, vote for this guy, don't vote for that guy. The Catholic Church will never say, we can get into it, vote for this guy, don't vote for that guy. Maybe some members of the Catholic Church will. We can get into it. The Catholic Church, including the bishops, will never say, vote for this guy and don't vote for that guy. They may say, if you vote for this guy who's choosing this policy that goes against the fundamental values of the human person, you, therefore, are contributing to it. But that's a difference. There's a difference there.
Right. I mean, it seems like a small difference. I see what your point is, but it does seem like a small difference to a lot of the general public. I'm not claiming to know that we should have gone to Libya and that was a great decision. That was the best possible decision at the time. I can't possibly know that. But I did get the sense that these were people who could not help themselves and that were being threatened by a dictator who was willing to just wipe people out. And in that instance, the principle of solidarity comes in, which is that these people cannot defend themselves. There's nobody there to defend them, so someone needs to come in. And again, there are plenty of times in human history when we should have done that as a country, or when the UN should have done that, and it continues. It's not like the UN or the US suddenly is perfect in terms of its moral decision making. But to say that we've screwed up in the past doesn't mean that because we're making a decision to do this, say, in Libya, means that that's a bad decision, or that it's a worse decision. So that's kind of where I stand on that, I suppose.
We want to give you an opportunity in the last half hour or so of this discussion to ask questions. So if you want to line up behind either microphone, and I can tell Father has already touched something off, we would ask, however, that if you will, that we not make this a forum for speeches, but for reasoned exchange and questions for our esteemed panelists here. And we'll give everyone an opportunity that we can to ask questions. And we will start right there.
Michael, you said that the person who wanted the right of self-determination through self-termination, as far as the right to die.
The end-of-life issue.
Yeah, end-of-life issue. So you said that person, their primary responsibility was to themselves, the family members, etc., but they were focused on themselves. So a rhetorical question is, if you believe in capitalism, if you have business A has a contract, exclusive contract with business B, and business C actually interjects themselves into that contract and starts doing business, does business C have a moral obligation to business A, which they weren't doing any business? So this brings up to the question of what you were talking about in the line of reasoning, and I'd like to know what your reasoning is as far as the couple that we talked about, the couple that was married and the person that comes in. So if you look at the marriage contract, which is a contract, right, why should that person have any moral obligation, the person who's interjecting into that contract? And then also, if there is not a marriage contract, let's say that they're not married, but yet they're going in an exclusive relationship, does the moral obligation become any less? And I'd like to know the reasoning.
Right. So basically, what you're talking about very broadly is that there's a contract or a handshake or some sort of decision made between two parties to go forward with some venture, and that when one party breaks kind of the exclusive vow and starts doing business with a third party, where does the kind of on whose shoulders does the responsibility fall? And like I said before, I think as one of the two parties who entered into that contract, those are the two people that at the very most have a responsibility to keep that contract, to keep their duties and their obligations towards one another. But that's not to excuse other people who come in and can kind of snake their way in, connive their way to getting or tricking or luring other people from that obligation. Now, that's not to say that that person should have all the blame, or that the person in the relationship should have all the blame either. I think it's kind of shared, but I do think that once you come to a contract with someone, once you come to a decision, I mean, if I tell you that I'm going to meet you for dinner, and then someone else says, hey, Michael, well, why don't you come hang out with me and watch a movie, and then I don't show up to the movies, I don't show up to dinner with you. I mean, if I told you, well, this guy asked me to go to the movies, so sorry, I'm sorry I left you hanging. Well, most of the responsibility would fall onto my shoulders. It would be very hard for me to make the case that person was completely at fault for what happened, right? So I hope that answers your question.
How does this third person see having responsibility?
Knowing that there's a obligation and a contract signed between two people, and I don't mean signed in a very literal sense, but knowing that that's happening and willingly going forward with something that you know is going to harm that third party, that would be why I think it's immoral. I think we have to take the next question.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, there was a statement from by Father Jonathan that human life is inviolable. Now, who said that? I didn't hear God say it. I don't even know if he's around. And if I ever, God forbid, get in a situation where I'm in very excruciating pain, I might want to tell the people that are surrounding me, I want the plug pulled. And to get a guy to come in from some church and say, no, you can't do that. Who the hell is he? It's none of his business. It's my life. If I want to have it ended, I should have the right to have it ended. I don't see how anybody else can have any authority in it.
If God were around, this whole conversation would be much easier.
Very good. No, it's a great, did you finish your question? I'm sorry.
Yes.
It's an excellent question, and I have the great blessing in my life, and it's also hard, to spend time with people in the hospital who are going through things like that. I was walking on the way here, I ran into a woman from my parish whose father committed suicide last night. So I'm not separated from that reality. That said, it's important to first of all make the distinction between the legal right and the moral right. Right? In other words, I'm not talking about here. It would be it'd be interesting discussion. But I'm not talking when I said human life is inviolable. I'm not saying that no government should be able to make a law, et cetera, et cetera. It's different. Okay. The reason why I said human life is inviolable and that should be protected is that I believe that given the gift of human reason, we're able to grasp that health isn't of itself a good thing, and that life is a good thing, and that we can't make a decision ever, that we shouldn't make a decision ever, to say, I am going to choose the opposite of that. And I think we can, even though in a situation like that, it's extremely difficult. But I think as human beings, when we're healthy, for example, we're able to see, that is a constitutive good of who I am, life. And I should be able to respect it. And how wonderful it would, and this gets more into the political choice of whether it should be legal or not, but when a society says, no, it's okay to do that,
we lose motivation as well to go up to you when you are suffering that sickness and to say, I'm here with you. I'm going to help you through this. And thank God we have science that gives us palliative care. Thank God for science. But thank God, too, for us being able to say, I'm going to comfort this person while they're dying. I'm going to show them my love. I'm going to give my life to them. I'm going to allow them not to suffer loneliness. That should be an ideal of society, rather than say, hey, life really, it's really not worth that much. Better to get rid of it.
If I'm laying in a sick bed and you come in, you say, look, I'm going to comfort you, I'm going to visit you, and I say to you, look, it still hurts, your act doesn't do the job, so leave me alone already, let me die.
Sir, I understand the situation.
Let's get a question over here.
You brought up a lot of atheists and a lot of religions, but no one's mentioned Unitarian Universalists, which is a group of people that I don't consider themselves religion, but deeds without creeds, who do good, as you both said. Based on that, what I just said about accepting everybody in their church.
I want to make sure I understand you, because there is, and I was talking to the Pew people, there's a growing number of people who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they have a belief system. It may be God, it may, whatever you want to call that higher being. That higher being may be something within themselves. Is that what you're trying to address? I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious.
Yes, because you don't have to be religious to be Unitarian. You could be an atheist, you could be a Jewish person, you could be a Catholic person, you could be a Protestant, you could be anything. It's the idea that they get together and accept everybody under the same...
Right. Well, I mean, people definitely employ words like God and religion and spiritual in many different ways. There's something on the Upper West Side of Manhattan called the New York Society for Ethical Culture, which is similar to the Unitarian churches in that they actually consider themselves a religious, humanist community. And I've actually spoken at one of their Sunday services, which is very church-like, without mention of God and things like of that nature. My personal view on these things is that they're great, and they fill a hole that a lot of people seek who leave the church. What I was talking about before, the sense of community that a church provides. People are able to now go find these elsewhere. I'm not a member, and I don't go. I like to sleep in on Sundays, so I don't go to these things. And I found or I filled my sense of community elsewhere. But I think these are great organizations and great structures. I don't know if you had a more specific question.
Well, based on the fact that they're accepting of everything and anybody, but I want to throw out a question to the priest. Why hasn't the Catholic Church come to the point where it's acceptable to have a woman ordained, like ministers accept women to be ministers?
Sure. Let me, I will answer you in a second, specifically, but I think it fits within a broader circle, and that is what you mentioned about the Unitarian church or community. I think it's a wonderful thing to have community settings in which everybody shares what they believe and are accepting of each other, and accepting also of the fact that I respect you no matter what you believe and all of that. That's wonderful, and it should be encouraged, and I think this is part of that, right? I think it's a wonderful thing. At the same time, I also don't think it's healthy, because I believe that truth is a good thing, and to say, listen, your understanding of truth, of religion, of God, or whatever, is equally as true as mine, right? I don't, because if I say, hey, God exists, and you say, God doesn't exist, and say, hey, isn't that wonderful? We all believe the same thing. No, we don't. And so I think that's a danger, and I think it's called religious or moral relativism. And the idea that, to say, Chris, to your point, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious, these are all a little bit different topics, but I think we are spiritual not because of any work of our own, but because God gave us a spiritual soul. And that aspiration for the transcendence and for all of that, that's something God did. Being religious, okay, or one way to understand it, is responding to that, what I would call gift of spirituality. And that's why there has never been a culture that has prolonged over a long period of time, which has not had some religious expression. And I think it's a pretty strong point, if not evidence. It's an interesting point. And then now specifically to the question about, I think you're getting at, why isn't the church more inclusive, right? And that's just one example. Another example, why doesn't the Catholic Church accept homosexuality, right? That's another one. I mean, I'm just thinking of the hot topics that come up to me. Each one of those has a different, and we could talk about them for a long time, but the Catholic Church believes that not only can we understand some moral absolutes, but that Jesus founded a church, and that Jesus gave the authority to the church not to individual human beings to be perfect. The Pope is not perfect. The Pope is not sinless, please, and I certainly am not. But that the Catholic Church has the ability to make choices, right, in the areas of faith and morals that are in line with God's will. Okay? And John Paul II explained, specifically about that point of female ordination, he said, if you look at the priesthood as a power thing, well then, my gosh, it's absolutely unfair that priests can only be men, or only men can be priests. On the other hand, if you look at it in a different way, and that was why Jesus, even though he had women around him and breaking all sorts of social norms, he chose 12 men to exercise not only the priesthood, but a paternal element of God. I believe there's also a maternal element of God. In this area of priesthood, it's also an expression of God's paternity. I hope that. And therefore, the Catholic Church, John Paul II said, doesn't have the authority to change something that Jesus himself instituted.
Well, okay, two things.
I'm
Sorry.
afraid we're going to, because there's so many people waiting, we're going to have to move on to other topics.
If I could just add real quick, though, I mean, both of us believe that there are some objective standards to morality.
I know you do, Michael.
There are certainly a lot of people who do not believe that, and I think they belong to both religion and non-religion. And it is bothersome sometimes to come across communities that say, well, really, who are we to say that that's bad? But I just want to note that maybe, definitely for different reasons, I think we have different senses of what that means. But I was interested also in what you said about all cultures, all people have had some sort of expression about some sort of religious expression. And I wonder if you think what I do as a secular person, do events and write about all sorts of things I'm interested in, or think about like Richard Dawkins, who spent most of his career doing public popularizing of the theory of evolution. Is that sort of, to you, is that sort of a sign of his religious-like dedication to some idea?
Well, certainly there is, I think some atheists have chosen atheism as their religion. I don't think that's your case. I think we are all responsible to God, and as much as God reveals himself to us. And that means we have to develop our spirituality. And if organizations like Center for Inquiry are truly trying to develop the gift of reason, and I know you are, Michael, and seeking the truth, I think, my gosh, you may be in a higher place than heaven than me.
Well, that would be great.
Oh, dear.
Both of the speakers agree that the basis for morality is our obligation to other human beings. My question is this: does that obligation extend to other species? I think I know what you'll answer, Michael, because you're a vegetarian.
Yeah, I do, and it comes in degrees, and most of it for me depends on what sort of cognitive capacity the creature has or the species has. So I feel an ethical obligation to dolphins and primates, not to the cockroach that I find in the kitchen, right? And so I do think And this has been actually, a complaint lodged at humanism, which is a large part of what the Center for Inquiry tries to do, which is, that morality should focus on human nature and evidence from the natural world. And, it's been kind of lodged at humanism that it focuses too much on humans and not enough on broadening our care for other creatures that might be able to experience things that, actually matter to us ethically. So I do think that we should keep broadening that spectrum. And someone like Peter Singer has done a lot of good work on this, I think. But I'm not sure actually where the Catholic Church stands on this.
Well, I think, first of all, it's an excellent question. I think there's a lot of confusion out there. Bolivia just made a proposal to the UN the other day that every single species and Mother Nature itself be given the same rights as human beings. And I don't understand why the UN didn't accept it, quite honestly, because I don't think the United Nations right now has a strong enough moral compass to be able to do that. They certainly wouldn't be able to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that you mentioned, Michael, which was one of my favorite documents of all time, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's based on a profoundly Christian anthropology, quite honestly. I mean, the history that came forth from it, that it came from, is profoundly Christian. A Christian understanding, as I've explained it, in terms of reason, right, that we're able to. And so I think it is super key to be able to say there is not only a qualitative difference, a substantial difference, but a huge difference between any other being that does not have the gift of intelligence and reason as we see it in human beings. Now, exactly where do we, because first of all, I believe that God used the evolution, right? I'm not a creationist as such, and so I know that there are some animals that seem to be getting closer and closer, right? Or maybe we're understanding them more and more. And I can't totally identify every one of those differences, but I believe we have to recognize that human intelligence, reason, is a qualitative, substantial, delineating factor. And yes, we have obligations to animals, but animals themselves don't have rights as human beings have rights. We have a responsibility not to beat up on those animals because it's dehumanizing. And also because, as I would see it, these are creatures of God that deserve our respect, but don't have human rights as such.
Over there.
You've brought up human reason several times in several contexts, and always you say it is imperfect, which it generally is. You said we are not capable on our own of getting the right answers when we make our calculations about morality or moral decisions or ethical questions. You seem to imply quite strongly that the discernment of God's will is an adjunct to reason. How, pray tell, sir, do we discern the will of God?
How do we discern the will of God? Well, I think it begins with using what I would call the God-given gift of reason. At the same time, recognizing that I really do believe it's imperfect, as we see that some people have very little intelligence, quite honestly, right? And some people have a far superior intelligence to me.
And would you also agree, and I think this is something we see in the political debate, it's easy to disparage Congress. They have approval ratings below journalists, so you know it's really bad, and below lawyers.
Lawyers too, wow.
Yeah. But I find when I go to Washington and I talk to the vast majority of members of Congress and their staffs, these are hardworking people. They do care about their constituency. They may care to greater and lesser degrees about how that plays into them getting reelected, but they do care about their constituencies. They want to do good, but their religious perspective often leads them into very divergent paths, Father, about, again, what is defined as good. Mm-hmm. And if what they define as good is different than what the other guy defines as good, does that make them bad?
Right. Well, certainly it's hard to decipher all of these things. And when it gets down to specifically the will of God, of course, if you even mention that, then we're already on the level of belief in God, right? The existence of God. And once we're at that level, then I would say continuing to decipher the will of God happens in different ways. Never, knowing that God can never tell us to act in contrary to reason. He can never tell us to, because we believe that God is the author of our reason. But then we also believe in revelation. We believe that God reveals himself to us, and it comes in different ways. We believe, for example, that the Bible is inspired by God. We believe that the entirety of it, okay, not one specific passage that tells us, that God was happy when the Israelites killed their enemies, but in its entirety, we can decipher what God wants of us in big terms. We also, I believe, in a personal experience of God, and that we can be inspired. The woman who I told you about, whose father committed suicide last night, I was outside in front of my church, and somebody wanted to give me a cross because today's Palm Sunday, wanted to make it for me. And I was there, and she was adamant about making it for me. And in that moment, I had I considered it to be inspiration from God, just to stay there. And I said, I bet you I'm going to give this to somebody who really needs it. Okay, I was walking, and I'm far away from just down the block here, far away from my church, and I run into this woman who actually is secretary of the parish. And she looked at me, and she gave me this big hug, and her father committed suicide last night. And I'm holding this palm cross in my hand. And I knew exactly in that moment, I think the will of God for me was to give this to her. Call it what you like. But in other words, I think there's different levels of revelation from God, but I think we can grasp that through the gift of reason enlightened by faith.
Right, and this actually goes back to what I was talking about before when I mentioned that every religious person looks into their holy book and decides what is good and what is not good to some degree. And you just said that God wouldn't command something contrary to our reasoning about what is good and what is not good. I mean, that's kind of my point, is that how do you figure out, I mean, if God has told, apparently people have claimed that God has told them to do really awful things too. How do we know that that's not God's will? I mean, if we just arbitrarily say, well, everything that God does is good, then like I said, it seems kind of arbitrary to say, well, he would never do something bad. He would only do something good. But
that's why I say not all religions are equally good. That's why I think anyone who says God commanded me to commit in his name isn't listening well. And that's not God. That's what I believe.
Right, but if there are reasons why we as human beings can decide what is good, why do we need to take the extra step and refer to God, I suppose? I mean, if we can look into the Bible and say, well, God would only command us to do good things, and good things are this, why do we need to have the whole God equation? We could just say good things are this, we should do good things.
Well, we don't need the God element of the equation in order to fix what our reason can't get. If God exists, then we need him.
Right, and this is something that we talked about before, or at least I mentioned before, that that's just the difference we're going to have when we have these moral conversations. There are probably there's some common ground that we can come to, but at some point, again, the existence of God is going to come up, and that's going to kind of hinder our ability to move forward.
Right.
Speaking of moving forward.
Maybe not. Maybe I will convert at the end of this talk.
We have time for just a few more questions.
Well, I mean, this might be relevant because in my life I've had many conversations where I've either come up with a contradiction or something I perceived as a philosophical contradiction inherent in, say, Christianity, or I'd bring one up that I'd read somewhere else, Thomas Paine, what have you. And so many times I'd have a conversation with someone who didn't have a good answer, and eventually their answer would be, well, I don't know, it's not up to me to say. It's not my place to say. And I think more so than the idea of reason is the idea that so many people I've met who have what they would call a relationship with God, ultimately, they've either never grappled with what I see as intractable contradictions or absurdities inherent in that particular religion. It's that they say, well, I'm passing the responsibility and the authority up to somebody else. And that to me isn't reason at all. That to me is saying, well, you might be right that it doesn't make sense to do what I'm doing in the light of pure reason, but I believe because of the denomination I belong to, because of the people who I grant credence to, that they've made arguments and they hold sway, and that's the end of it for me. So, and in fact, it seems to me that philosophically the nature of Christianity is when you get to a point where something doesn't seem to make sense, you just accept that there's a boss who thinks it makes sense, so you should just drop it. And I mean, is that your relationship? Is that how you feel about how to wrestle with moral conundrums? Moral conundrums.
Yeah, is God your boss? And if so, how is he as a boss, actually? Does he let you come in
Pretty
late?
good, pretty patient. With me, he's pretty patient.
I mean, that's you're talking about dogma. That's what dogma is. That is saying that there are just some things that I'm not questioning. I'm following these rules.
No,
and
I don't
it,
think that's
isn't
what
it?
I don't think that's what dogma is.
That comes in all forms.
I think it's always good to question. I think it's always good to question.
Right,
If
but what I'm saying
questioning,
is that there are
if
certain
questioning
people that don't
means
question, that would be dogma.
if questioning means trying to grasp through the gift of intelligence what the truth is.
But do you think it's essential to grant authority to a conscious being other than yourself
we do that,
to reason?
We
to
do
the
that,
reasoning
first of all,
for
we
you?
do that all the time.
But
We do
ultimately,
it-
philosophically,
in other
we
words,
don't.
we do it on lots of different levels in our lives. I wasn't there when man landed on the moon. Okay? We
Right, but
recognize
part of
that-
secularism is that you could meet experts who could explain in every single reasonable detail about how it was done, and if you had any objections or if there was something that didn't make sense to you, you could raise that, and there hopefully there'd be an answer to that too.
Well, there's a couple things that experts haven't been able to grasp, and that is how our universe began in the first place. What was the origin of matter? Okay? You're not going to find a consensus, or even close to that, of experts to say the origin of nature, the origin of material came, or an understanding of, I think, another very powerful reason of free will. And I don't believe that that my belief in God can be proven scientifically, right? And therefore, we enter into the realm of faith. But faith is not jumping off a cliff going, oh my gosh, what the heck, Reason, I believe, leads me to a point. And then I believe, too, in inspiration. In other words, my soul, my being begins to perceive that there is something beyond the here and now, that there is something, what I would call the supernatural realm. And faith is, therefore, not blind, but rather motivated. Motivated by reason and by grace.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It's been really engaging. I particularly enjoyed the consensus that seems to be here about the idea of well-being or fulfillment as being sort of the criterion for going about choosing morally, and I assume that this applies in everyday situations and also the hard cases. So I'm wondering, I've got two particular questions I want to focus on yourself, Michael. The first one was with an apparent tension, at least from what I heard in some views of yours. One whereby you said that, we all have, by virtue of the respect that we owe each other, inalienable rights, that we ought to be treated never as a mere means, but always in an end, as Kant said. And then the other principle that you talked about, the principle of do no harm, but then you also said without very good reason. So I'm just wondering there, because you yourself said that you didn't prescribe to consequentialism, I'm wondering whether there seems to be a tension between the idea that we have these certain fundamental inalienable rights that can't never be treated against, but then there's some situations where we can do a sort of weighing up and a measuring. So I'm wondering, first of all, if you could sort of explain what, your position there. And then the second one was when we talked about the respect that we owe other persons by virtue of their ability to feel pain or their experience of pleasure and these sort of things as grounding our respect towards them. I'm just wondering whether that doesn't really grasp the nature of human equality, because if these sorts of things which can come and go with different stages in our person's lives, depending on whether they're in a coma, whether you're prior to birth, or these sorts of things, it seems to ground human equality in sort of accidental things rather than essential things. So isn't it true that, or is it true that human virtues have dignity by virtue of the kind of beings that we are, rather than in respect of certain qualities that we get when we reach certain stages that can come and go? Because doesn't that have a more accurate account of human equality and dignity that can be respected across all stages of life and in different conditions, in grave or in health?
Right. I mean, even if the ability to be conscious is accidental, though, in looking back at the theory of evolutionary process, doesn't make it any less important, per se. But I still do see it in degrees. I mean, this is why, to bring up something that would be, we've kind of avoided the whole time, but the abortion issue. I think that the woman who's carrying the baby, up until a certain point, has, or we have more obligation to treat her in a certain way than we do to treat the fetus or the embryo that's inside of her. And that is based on my, whole view that a lot of this comes in degrees. But certainly once you reach a certain point, that would ground our view of human equality, that everyone has these capacities. There's a lot more that goes into it, because you can look at people who don't have these capacities. Well, someone is, mentally stunted. Well, does he mean less than other human beings? And I would say not necessarily, no, because he can still experience certain things, and he still has people surrounding him that have interests in keeping that person alive. So there's a lot that goes into it. I didn't mean to suggest that my kind of ethical system is simple, and that there is just kind of one or two rules that I look at. So I do think something like your first question had to do with the consequences and the kind of tension between inalienable rights and virtues and ideas and the consequences. And there's certainly a tension, but I mean, I don't negate that consequences matter, but often they don't to me. And so it's not for me to say that, well, consequences always matter, consequences don't always matter. But so, for instance, I recently, on Rationally Speaking, the blog I read on, wrote a post defending both morally and legally this fellow Terry Jones in Florida who burned the Quran as not being responsible whatsoever for what happened in Afghanistan. And a lot of people argued, well, a lot of people said that the consequences would be that people in Afghanistan would riot and people would die. To me, that consequence does not whatsoever mean that we should limit the inalienable right to free speech, because first off, he was not totally responsible for it. They're the ones that, as conscious beings, made the decision to go out and riot. But there's definitely tension between the two, but I tend to side more with inalienable rights and virtues than I do with weighing the consequences. But those consequences, you can reason about those and think about those, and those actually might influence whether or not you think rights should be inalienable in the first place. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Just briefly what you said.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead. We're going to take another question.
Yeah, you can come up. We can talk after.
Okay, you made the comment earlier about reason not being perfect, and I would certainly agree with that. But it doesn't seem to me that having faith is any less more perfect, or is probably even more imperfect than using reason.
Father?
That's a very good point, I think, very good question or point. I don't believe that anybody in particular, okay, can have or should depend on or trust their faith in as much as it is a personal belief, right? But rather, we take reason, we take what we could call reason inspired by faith, and then we have to check it against sources that we trust. Okay, and that's why I don't think God left us alone. I think that's why God gave us the Ten Commandments, for example. I think that's why God gave us, in my faith, Jesus. He didn't leave us alone. God gave us the church because he didn't leave us alone. Precisely because we can't have perfect knowledge, and we can't have perfect faith.
I was debating in my own mind whether or not to ask this question, but I'm dying to hear the answer, so bear with me. And I know what I know, and I don't know what I don't know, and I'm not even very sure about what I know.
Sound like Donald Rumsfeld.
So bear with me. I'm wondering to what degree the proof is in the pudding. I see, of course, in the history of the human family, there's monsters abounding, both coming from religious places and from atheistic places. And so there's lots of individual cases of monsters on both sides of this question. Looking at it from a broad, global, historical perspective, at least in the last 100 years, what I see now, my bias is I'm coming from the religious side of things, and I'm seeing certain things and not seeing other things, so please enlighten me on this. What I see is you have regimes over the last 100 years where you have, you've got Pol Pot and Mao and Stalin, you've got tens of millions of innocent people who have been murdered, coming from regimes that are
I have
motivated.
to ask you to get to the
Move it to the
question,
point.
just because
I have a
there are
feeling I know
people
what the
waiting.
And
question
on the
is.
other side, you've got
Yeah.
organizations that are feeding more people and taking care of more AIDS patients on the religious side. And so I don't know what I don't know. Enlighten me. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I have a feeling your question is basically the charge, and I think you did a short phone thing with Richard Dawkins one time, which you made the same claim, that there have been terrible atheists in humanity. Certainly, which is why I don't run around screaming that the most important thing or the only thing that I am is an atheist. Atheism doesn't really provide any sort of direction in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the sort of societies that, these dictators and these rulers were certainly not pushing open and free inquiry. There was no questioning their power and their legitimacy. And that's not what, secular values are all about. The secular society is about the fact that there are no sacred cows, that we're able to question all these things. So the fact that there are terrible atheists to me doesn't really mean anything, because there are definitely terrible atheists in the world. There have been terrible atheists in humanity, just as there have been terrible, terrible religious people. I mean, talk about the Inquisition and things of that nature. But the fact is that these people were, for a large part, not doing these things out of their atheism. Some of them were, but they were not. These were not societies based on reason and free inquiry, and that were pushing 2,500 years of moral philosophy on people. So I get the claim. I mean, it's true. You can go back and look. And I guess you didn't mention Hitler because presumably he was a Roman Catholic of some sort. But it's just kind of like this debate has actually been going on for a while. People have been bringing this argument up all the time, and because I don't value atheism in itself. I mean, I am an atheist, but I don't think that if we lived in an atheistic society, we'd be in any better shape necessarily. We need to be in a society that's secular, that's humanist, that's rational.
Absolutely, and I fully agree that atheism doesn't make you kill. Atheism doesn't make you be bad. But I do believe that if you are faithful to the teachings of this belief in a human being having been created by God with an inherent dignity, with a spiritual soul, if you are faithful to that, not using God for your own purposes, political purposes and economic purposes and abuse purposes, not that, but if you are faithful to that element of Christian faith, right, and Jewish faith, of recognizing that we have been made in the image and likeness of God, if you're faithful to that, that is a very strong protection from something like those regimes that we talked about over the last century.
Right. I mean, unfortunately, though, that kind of draws a line in the sand too often and says, well, if you're faithful to this sort of thing, then you belong to this community. But other people who are not faithful to this sort of thing sometimes suffer at the hands of that.
Sure. Well, that's wrong, and that's not being open-minded and kind and caring. And
right. But I mean, a large part of what I've been talking about, and when I talked about my opening statement, was that atheists and secularists and humanists can have this ethical obligation to other human beings to provide them a certain level of dignity and respect without referring to God or divine
couldn't
source.
agree more, Michael.
I think we're going to take one last question, and then I think you'll both be around, right? I mean, I know
Absolutely.
that we've gone a little beyond our time, but the conversation is is fascinating. I find it fascinating. I hope you found it fascinating. And we'll take this last question. And those of you, I'm sorry you've been waiting so long, please come up and feel free to continue the conversation. But let's take this last question.
I just have two comments. One is...
Can we ask it to be a question just because we didn't want to make this a forum for long statements?
Okay, I'll try to make it into question form. First, about the rise of the other animals or plants or even microorganisms. As a biologist and a particular evolutionary biologist, I do think, well, first, I do not think humans are uniquely different from the other animals, okay? So we are different in some ways, but not unique. And I do not accept the principle to make a decision whether or not to give the other plants or animals the protection based on whether or not they have intelligence. And just like you cannot apply that principle in the human society just because someone is less intelligent than you, then you can treat that person badly. I don't think you would agree with that. So on the same token, you cannot apply that principle to the other plants and animals. And one example is that what we are sitting here today, or standing here or sitting here today, this place used to belong to the other plants or animals, or in microorganisms. Just because we humans are today are so powerful and so selfish, so we denied the other plants and animals and the microorganisms the right to live. Okay, but that's bad for the earth and as well as bad for the human society. So
So your question is?
My question is whether you can, when you make moral judgment, okay, whether you should only based on a human perspective or only based on human interest. That's my question.
Right, and this actually goes along the lines of the question before, which was that do our moral obligations actually stretch broader than just human beings? And I guess the point that you're kind of making is that the difference between certain non-human animals like primates and humans is not a difference in kind, but in degree. And I would agree with you, but I do think there are large degrees in between. And I do think there's, the ability for us to reason and the capacity for consciousness does have important implications for our ethical obligations to other creatures. I didn't get there was another question that you asked, but I didn't.
I'll just very quickly answer what I think was the question. That is, I think you're right that it shouldn't be just a question of degree of intelligence that determines, but rather, as I would say it, a rational nature is what distinguishes, in terms of responsibilities to human beings, why it's so different than to animals and plants. Doesn't mean we have no responsibilities to creation, no responsibility to animals or plants, but it's a huge difference, and it's based on not on the degree of intelligence, but rather on a rational nature.
Well, I disagree with that either, but I won't dwell on that question. But my second question or comment is, I think
I'm sorry, we have to let that, because there have been other people waiting for questions, so we're going to leave it at that one question. I did want to give Michael and Father one final chance to have a comment, and again, they'll be here if you want to continue to talk. Sure. But as I was looking at some of the things in preparation for this, Michael, I have been particularly fascinated by the appeal of Christopher Hitchens, who I think has sparked a lot of debate. You may think whether it's good or bad, people can make their own judgment, but has sparked a lot of debate. And he was asked, and many of you may know that he found out he had terminal cancer and said famously the most quoted thing was, "Don't pray for me." But I thought when he was interviewed in a British newspaper, he was asked, as people often are at the end of their lives, these big questions, do you think you have been a good person? And Christopher Hitchens' answer was, no, not particularly. Not as the world counts these things, because the world expects for that definition to apply a good deal of selflessness. And while no one scores very high on that, I score lower than most. I don't do much living for others. I really don't. When you look at the concept of good and the concept of doing good in the world and leaving behind something good, does it necessarily, and as part of your own moral code, include a high degree of selflessness?
Certainly. I mean, morality is about, as I talked about before, all of our moral beliefs and values concern people in society. So that morality is not about, just your own actions, and to.
And when we
to
fall
dedicate
short,
yourself,
most often, is it because our often inclination is to do what's best for us?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a certain degree of self-interest, and that needs to be, to some degree, taken down a notch. And you have to recognize that there are other people in the world who deserve your respect, and that you have ethical obligations to help those people. Hitchens is brutally honest in saying that he doesn't think he's done very much of that. And I think he might be underselling himself a little bit. I mean, say what you want to say about Christopher Hitchens, but he's been, reporting from war zones and writing essays for 25 or 30 years, maybe even longer. So to say that he's not contributed, I mean, there are many different ways to contribute. There are multiple different ways to contribute to doing good. So to say that he's not done any good, maybe he hasn't done as much good as other people, but it's not to say that he's not done any good.
And I suppose that begs the question, if he puts himself into war zones because he loves it and because there's a thrill and there's an excitement, does that diminish the good he may do in providing a service to people who need to know what's going on in that war zone?
Not necessarily. I get a thrill out of being on stage and talking about these things.
Even with your family in the audience?
Even with my Roman Catholic family in the audience, yeah. So I get a thrill out of these things. I really enjoy them, and I don't think, you actually hit on this before, and that being good makes us feel good. I don't think there's anything wrong. I mean, if doing good things actually made us feel bad, that would be a problem. I don't think it's a problem that being good to other people actually makes us feel good as well. I mean, that's actually probably part of the system, in that being good to other people.
Right. I would say yes, but also sometimes doing good feels really bad. And that brings up the question of, well, what about what's in this for me, or is good about being selfless? I think it is, right? And I think it has to do with the fundamental principle for me in terms of understanding what is moral and what's good, and that is love, right? It's loving others for their own sake, right? Not for what they can give to me, but loving others for their own sake. And I would also include that loving God. And that's ultimately selfless. And if there is no heaven, okay, if there is no, sometimes doing the ultimate act of love, for example, dying for a friend, right, in which we will never feel good afterwards for sure, because we're going to be dead, then it's hard to found I'm not saying it's impossible, but it becomes increasingly hard to be good if there's no God, or there is no life after death. And that's why I think, yes, moral living has to do with selflessness profoundly. Sometimes it feels good, sometimes it doesn't, but it's loving, as you said, Michael, that people are ends in and of themselves, right? They cannot be used.
But I mean, at the same time, a lot of the good, you could say, I think the debate is kind of less black and white and more gray, but a lot of the good that secular people do, they do for the sake of doing good, whether or not they're going to get any sort of reward.
Yeah, that's true.
Later in life, and I do think, I don't think it's fair to say that, well, all religious people, when they do good, they're just doing it because they think they're going to get some reward. It's a kind of a silly thing, but I think that I'm sorry, and I speak as a secular person, I think that secular people can form that sort of moral framework where they have duties to one another, to do good and to treat them in a certain way, again, without having to deal with calculations about God and the afterlife.
I believe they can too.
On a note of agreement, we will end and invite those of you who wish to stay, but I want to thank Michael. I want to thank Father Jonathan. I think it was an extraordinary discussion this afternoon. Thank you so much.